The mahogany doors of Whitmore Associates slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed through the marble-floored lobby like a gunshot. Isabella Whitmore, though apparently I wasn't supposed to use that name anymore, stood in the rain-soaked street, clutching a crumpled piece of paper that had arrived that morning. The formal letterhead bore the seal of Judge Harrison's probate court, but the message was anything but formal. Your presence is requested at the final settlement of the estate of Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, deceased. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 months, I'd been systematically excluded from every family meeting, every hushed phone call, every decision about my grandmother's affairs. My own blood had treated me like a stranger, an inconvenience to be managed rather than a granddaughter to be included. And now, suddenly, the court was requesting my presence. Through the rain-streaked windows of the law firm, the same firm where I'd spent countless childhood summers organizing files and learning the weight of justice, I could see shadows moving in the conference room on the 3rd floor. My family was already there. My mother, Patricia, sharp-shouldered and perpetually disappointed. My uncle Richard, grandmother's golden child who'd taken over the day-to-day operations of the firm years ago. My cousin Marcus, fresh from law school and already wearing $1,000 suits like armor. Even my Aunt Caroline had flown in from Seattle, her usual dramatic flair on full display as she gestured animatedly through the window. None of them had called me. None of them had even acknowledged that I existed these past months, not since the funeral where I'd stood alone at the graveside, watching them cluster together like a fortress I couldn't breach. The security guard inside, old Jimmy who used to sneak me cookies from the break room, caught my eye through the glass and shook his head almost imperceptibly. His weathered face held an apology I'd grown accustomed to seeing. Everyone was sorry, but no one was brave enough to stand against the family's collective decision that Isabella Whitmore was persona non grata. I pulled my grandmother's silk scarf tighter around my neck, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume that still lingered in the fabric. Chanel No. 5, classic and unwavering, just like she'd been. The scarf was one of the few things I'd been allowed to keep from her apartment before Richard had swooped in with professional movers and cleared everything out. For the estate, he'd explained with that patronizing smile that had always made my teeth ache. The rain was getting heavier, and my sensible heels, the same black pumps I wore to my job at the public defender's office, were starting to leak. I should have gone home to my studio apartment above the used bookstore on Maple Street. I should have changed out of the only good dress I owned, a navy blue sheath that I'd bought for job interviews and wore to court when I needed to look more expensive than I was. I should have accepted what everyone had been telling me for months, that I didn't belong here anymore. But the paper in my hand was from Judge Harrison himself, and Judge Harrison didn't make mistakes. He'd been my grandmother's contemporary, her occasional opponent in high-stakes cases, and later her grudging friend. If he said I belonged at this reading, then maybe, just maybe, someone still remembered that I was Margaret Whitmore's granddaughter. The law firm rose before me like a monument to everything I'd lost. 7 stories of red brick and limestone with brass nameplate that read, Whitmore Associates, established 1952. My great-grandfather had founded it with nothing but a law degree and an unshakable belief that justice could be bought and sold if you knew the right price. My grandmother had inherited it, transformed it, made it into something that mattered. Under her leadership, the firm had handled landmark civil rights cases, environmental lawsuits that had changed state law, and pro bono work that had kept half the city's nonprofits afloat. I had grown up in these halls watching my grandmother command respect with a raised eyebrow and a perfectly timed silence. She taught me that law wasn't about winning, it was about being right. She'd shown me how to research a case until my eyes burned, how to write a brief that could change minds, and how to stand in front of a judge and speak truth even when your voice shook. Everything I knew about being a lawyer, I'd learned at Margaret Whitmore's knee. And then she was gone, and suddenly, I wasn't a Whitmore anymore. I was just Isabella Romano. I'd kept my father's name after he died when I was 12, one of the few rebellions my family had allowed me. The first sign that things had changed came 2 days after the funeral. I'd shown up to the office as usual, ready to help sort through grandmother's caseload and figure out how to honor her commitments to her clients. Richard had been waiting for me in the lobby with a security guard and a box containing the few personal items I'd kept in the small office grandmother had set aside for me during law school.
"We appreciate everything you've done," he'd said, his voice carrying the exact tone he used with difficult clients. "But the family has decided that it would be better for everyone if we handled the transition internally." "I'm family," I'd said, and even now, standing in the rain 3 months later, I could hear how small my voice had sounded. "Of course you are, Isabella, but you're not a partner. You're not even an employee, technically. You were Margaret's project. And now," he'd shrugged, a gesture that encompassed everything that had changed now that my grandmother was no longer there to protect me. "My project," as if everything I'd accomplished, graduating magna cum laude from Georgetown Law, passing the bar on my first try, building a reputation as one of the most thorough young attorneys in the public defender's office, was nothing more than my grandmother's charity case. The rain was soaking through my coat now, and I could feel water dripping down my back, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Through the window, I could see Judge Harrison arriving, his silver hair unmistakable even from a distance. He moved with the careful dignity of a man who spent 40 years making decisions that changed lives, and he carried a leather portfolio that I recognized from countless court appearances. Behind him walked a woman I'd never seen before, tall, elegant, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat chignon. She moved like someone accustomed to boardrooms and power lunches, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to doubt her place in the world. When she paused at the building's entrance to shake the rain from her umbrella, I caught a glimpse of her profile and felt a strange jolt of recognition, though I was certain we'd never met. They disappeared into the building, and the conference room windows lit up as the meeting began. I could see the family arranged around the massive oak table that had anchored the room since my great-grandfather's time. Uncle Richard at the head, naturally, with Marcus at his right hand. Mother and Aunt Caroline flanked Judge Harrison, their postures rigid with the kind of tension that came from expecting good news and fearing disappointment in equal measure. The elegant woman had positioned herself slightly apart from the family group, and as I watched, she opened her portfolio and began distributing documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this many times before. An estate attorney, someone Richard had hired to make sure everything went smoothly, to ensure that grandmother's considerable assets were divided according to law and family expectation. I should have felt bitter. I should have been angry that they were carving up my grandmother's life while I stood outside in the rain like a beggar. But mostly, I felt empty. For 28 years, I'd believed I belonged somewhere. I'd believed that blood meant something, that the love my grandmother had shown me was reflected in the rest of the family, that my place in the Whitmore legacy was secure. The funeral had shattered that illusion. Sitting alone in the front pew while the rest of the family filled the rows behind me, I'd realized that I'd been living in a bubble my grandmother had created. Without her protection, her advocacy, her unwavering belief that I belonged, I was just another outsider trying to claim a piece of something that had never really been mine. But then there was the letter in my hand, now soggy from the rain, but still legible. Judge Harrison's letterhead, his signature, his personal seal. Whatever was happening in that conference room, he believed I had a right to be there. The decision crystallized in that moment, standing in the downpour with my grandmother's scarf around my neck and water filling my shoes. I wasn't going to let them erase me from her story. I wasn't going to let them pretend that the hours I'd spent learning at her side, the cases we'd discussed over dinner, the dreams she'd encouraged me to pursue were meaningless.
The silence stretched on for when I walked to the building's entrance, my heels clicking against the wet pavement, with more confidence than I felt. Jimmy looked up as I approached the security desk, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Miss Isabella, I don't think—" "Judge Harrison requested my presence," I said, holding up the damp letter. "Are you going to keep me from complying with a court order, Jimmy?" He studied the letterhead, then looked at my face, probably seeing too much of my grandmother in my stubborn expression, and sighed. "Elevator's working again. 3rd floor, conference room C." "I know where it is," I said softly. "I used to live here, remember?"
The elevator ride felt eternal. Each floor that passed brought back memories. The second floor, where I'd helped file briefs for the Riverside toxic waste case. The fourth floor, where grandmother's corner office had been, with its view of the courthouse and its walls lined with law books she'd actually read. The fifth floor, where the partners' meeting room had hosted dinners and strategy sessions that had shaped legal precedent across 3 states. The doors opened on the third floor, and I could hear voices from the conference room. Richard's voice, confident and controlling, explaining something about maintaining the firm's reputation and client relationships. Marcus agreeing with everything his father said, his young voice eager and sycophantic. Mother's occasional interjections, always focused on practical matters like tax implications and asset liquidity. I paused outside the conference room doors, my hand on the brass handle that had been polished to mirror brightness. Through the frosted glass, I could see the shapes of the people who had shaped my life, the family who had raised me and then abandoned me, gathered around the table where my grandmother had made the decisions that had defined her legacy. And then I heard Judge Harrison's voice, clear and authoritative. Before we proceed with the primary distributions, there is one additional matter that must be addressed. Isabella Romano Whitmore was specifically requested to be present for this portion of the reading. The room went silent. I could practically feel the tension radiating through the glass, could imagine the glances being exchanged, the careful masks of surprise and concern sliding into place. Your Honor, Richard's voice, smooth and diplomatic, I'm afraid Isabella was unavailable. Family circumstances, you understand. We can certainly provide her with any documentation. Your niece was sent a specific summons to be present. This is not optional, it is not a courtesy, and it is not subject to family politics. The reading will wait until she arrives. That was my cue. I turned the handle and stepped into the conference room, my wet shoes squeaking slightly against the hardwood floor. Every head turned toward me, and for a moment the silence was so complete I could hear the rain pattering against the windows. Your Honor, I said, my voice steadier than I dared to hope. Isabella Romano Whitmore, reporting as requested. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could see my reflection in the polished surface of the conference table, fractured and wavering like everything else in my life had become. My mother's face had gone pale, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking like a mask. Uncle Richard's expression cycled through surprise, annoyance, and something that might have been fear before settling on the patronizing smile I knew too well. Isabella, he said, rising from his chair with the kind of measured movement that courtroom veterans use to buy themselves thinking time. How unexpected. I'm afraid there's been some confusion. This is a private family matter.
Victoria Sterling smiled, and this time it was genuinely warm. Ms. Romano Whitmore, are you familiar with the legal structure of Whitmore and Associates? I blinked, trying to shift mental gears. It's a partnership. Grandmother was the senior partner, Uncle Richard and the other senior attorneys are partners, and there are several associates and junior partners. That's correct as far as it goes, Victoria said, but it's not complete. What you've described is the operational structure of the law firm. But Whitmore and Associates itself, the business entity, the building, the underlying assets, these are owned by a holding company called Whitmore Properties, LLC. The confusion in the room was palpable. Even Richard looked puzzled, and he'd been managing the firm's day-to-day operations for over a decade. I don't understand, Mother said, speaking for the first time since I'd entered the room. Margaret never mentioned a holding company. Because, Judge Harrison said, consulting his documents, Margaret Whitmore established Whitmore Properties, LLC in 1987, shortly after your father died, Isabella. The LLC was created for a specific purpose, to ensure that the Whitmore family legacy would continue through the family member who best embodied the firm's founding principles. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. What does that mean? Victoria Sterling opened the manila folder and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. It means, Ms. Romano Whitmore, that you are the sole owner of Whitmore Properties, LLC.
As of today, you own this building, the law firm's assets, its client contracts, its bank accounts, and its intellectual property. You own, in effect, Whitmore and Associates. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This wasn't surprise or confusion. This was shock so complete that it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Richard was the first to break. "That's impossible," he said, his voice rising despite his obvious effort to stay calm. "I've been managing this firm for 15 years. I've seen every contract, every financial statement, You've been managing the operational aspects of a firm you thought you would inherit," Victoria corrected gently. "Mrs. Whitmore was very careful to separate management from ownership. You've done excellent work, Mr. Whitmore, but you've been essentially an employee with profit-sharing arrangements." "This is ridiculous," Marcus burst out, his young face flushed with indignation. "Isabella doesn't even work here anymore. She's a public defender making $30,000 a year. She doesn't know anything about running a business." The criticism stung because it was partially true. I did make $30,000 a year, barely enough to cover my studio apartment and law school loans. I did work for the public defender's office, taking on the cases that nobody else wanted, fighting for clients who couldn't afford better representation. Compared to the family's success, my career looked like a series of noble failures. But Victoria Sterling was smiling again, and Judge Harrison was nodding as if Marcus had just proven a point they'd been hoping someone would make. "Actually," Victoria said, "that's exactly why Mrs. Whitmore structured her estate this way. She believed that the practice of law should serve justice, not just profit. She was concerned that the firm she'd built was becoming too focused on high-paying corporate clients and losing sight of its founding mission." She pulled out another document, this one bearing my grandmother's elegant handwriting. "I have a letter here that Mrs. Whitmore asked me to read in the event that anyone questioned her decision." My hands were trembling now, and I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Victoria cleared her throat and began to read. "To my beloved family, if you are hearing this letter, it means that I am no longer able to advocate for the person who has always best represented what the Whitmore name should mean. Isabella Romano Whitmore has spent her entire career fighting for people who cannot fight for themselves. She has chosen justice over profit, principle over convenience, and courage over comfort. She has never forgotten that the law exists to protect the powerless, not to enrich the powerful." My eyes were burning, and I could barely breathe. Even from beyond the grave, my grandmother was still protecting me, still believing in me when no one else would. The letter continued. "Richard, you are a talented attorney, and you have managed the firm's operations admirably. But you have also allowed it to drift away from its founding principles. Marcus, you are young and eager, but your eagerness is focused on personal advancement rather than public service. Patricia and Caroline, you have built successful lives, but you have never understood that wealth should be a tool for justice, not an end in itself." I could feel the family shock and hurt radiating across the table. But Victoria kept reading. "Isabella, my dear child, I know this will come as a surprise. I know you will doubt whether you are ready for such responsibility, but I have watched you for 28 years, and I have never seen you make a decision based on what would be easy rather than what would be right. The firm needs someone who remembers why it was founded. The firm needs you." The letter concluded with practical instructions. I would assume ownership immediately, but I could choose to maintain the current management structure if I wished. I could hire or fire partners at my discretion. I could redirect the firm's focus toward the kinds of cases I thought were important. I could, in essence, remake Whitmore and Associates in whatever image I thought would best honor my grandmother's memory. When Victoria finished reading, the silence was absolute. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could see the courthouse where I'd spent so many hours arguing for clients who couldn't afford better lawyers. I could see the public defender's office where I'd learned that justice was a luxury most people couldn't afford. I could see the street where I'd stood just 20 minutes earlier, convinced that I had been completely cut out of my grandmother's legacy. "I need a moment," I whispered.
Judge Harrison nodded. Of course. This is a significant revelation. Perhaps we should take a brief recess. But as I started to stand, Richard's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. This is a mistake, he said, his diplomat's mask finally slipping completely. Isabella is not equipped to run a firm of this size. She has no business experience, no management training, no understanding of what it takes to maintain the kind of client relationships that keep this place profitable. Uncle Richard, I started, but he wasn't finished. Do you have any idea what the monthly expenses are for this building? Do you know what we pay in malpractice insurance? Do you understand the liability issues involved in managing 37 employees? You're a bleeding heart public defender who's never managed anything more complex than a case calendar. Each word hit like a physical blow, partially because they contained grains of truth that I couldn't deny. I didn't know how to run a business. I had never managed employees. I had no idea what it cost to maintain a 7-story office building or how to navigate the complex web of client relationships that kept a major law firm profitable. But as Richard continued his litany of my inadequacies, something else began to rise in my chest. It wasn't anger, exactly, or hurt, though both of those were present. It was recognition. This was the voice that had been in the back of my mind for 3 months, the voice that had whispered that maybe the family was right to exclude me, that maybe I didn't belong in their world of expensive suits and high-stakes litigation. It was the voice my grandmother had spent my entire life helping me silence. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of her silk scarf around my neck, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume that still lingered in the fabric. When I spoke, my voice was steady and clear. "I write," I said, and Richard's satisfied smile began to form. "I don't know how to run a business. I don't understand profit margins or expense ratios or client development strategies.
I've never managed employees or negotiated complex contracts or dealt with malpractice insurance." The smile was fully formed now, and I could see him preparing to press his advantage. "But I do know why this firm was founded," I continued. "I know that great-grandfather started Whitmore Associates because he believed that everyone deserved good legal representation, regardless of their ability to pay. I know that grandmother spent 60 years building a reputation for taking cases that other firms wouldn't touch because they were too complicated, too controversial, or too unprofitable." I walked around the table, my wet shoes still squeaking slightly, but my steps steady and sure. I know that this firm used to be known for landmark civil rights cases, for environmental protection lawsuits that changed state law, for pro bono work that kept nonprofit organizations alive. I know what it used to stand for, and I know what it's become. I stopped directly across from Richard, the polished table reflecting both our faces like a mirror. "You want to know what I'm qualified for, Uncle Richard? I'm qualified to remember what justice looks like. I'm qualified to choose principle over profit. I'm qualified to carry on the legacy that grandmother actually built, not the profitable consulting business you've turned it into." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Richard calculating his response, weighing his options, trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had spun completely beyond his expectations. But it was Judge Harrison who spoke next, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades on the bench. "Ms. Romano Whitmore, the law is quite clear. You are the legal owner of Whitmore Properties, LLC, and all its assets. The question before us now is not whether you have the right to make decisions about the firm's future. You do. The question is what you intend to do with that right." I looked around the room, at my mother's worried face, at Marcus's obvious resentment, at Aunt Caroline's shell-shocked expression, at Victoria Sterling's encouraging nod. And then I looked at Richard,
who had spent the last 3 months systematically excluding me from my own family, who had treated my grandmother's death as an opportunity to consolidate power, who had never once asked what I thought or how I felt, or whether I might have something to contribute to the legacy we all supposedly shared. I intend, I said, to take some time to think about it, and I intend to learn everything I need to know to make the right decisions. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined. I sat in my tiny studio apartment surrounded by legal documents that Victoria Sterling had delivered personally the night before, trying to make sense of what my life had become in the span of 24 hours. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I couldn't bring myself to get up and reheat it. Every time I moved, the papers rustled, reminding me that this wasn't some elaborate dream. My phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. First, Uncle Richard, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, asking if we could meet to discuss the situation like reasonable adults. Then Marcus, younger and less diplomatic, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. Mother had called 3 times without leaving messages. Even Aunt Caroline had reached out, her voicemail a masterpiece of Southern passive aggression disguised as concern for my well-being. I hadn't answered any of them. Instead, I'd spent the night reading corporate bylaws, partnership agreements, financial statements, client contracts, all the documents that Victoria had organized with the kind of meticulous precision that made me understand why my grandmother had chosen her as an independent executor. Each page revealed another layer of the business I was suddenly responsible for, another set of obligations and opportunities I'd never imagined.
Whitmore Associates wasn't just a law firm, it was a small empire. The building alone was worth $12 million, sitting on prime downtown real estate that had appreciated steadily for 70 years. The client roster included 3 Fortune 500 companies, 2 major nonprofits, and the city's largest hospital system. The firm's annual revenue was approaching $8 million, with profit margins that would have made me dizzy if I'd been capable of processing numbers that large. But buried in the financial statements, I found traces of the firm my grandmother had described in her letter. Pro bono hours that had been steadily declining over the past decade, community outreach programs that had been quietly discontinued, a legal aid clinic that had been shuttered for efficiency reasons just 2 years earlier. Richard had been systematically transforming Whitmore Associates into exactly the kind of profitable, client-focused business that my grandmother had spent her life trying not to become. A knock on my apartment door interrupted my brooding. I glanced at the clock, 8:30 a.m., too early for social visits, too late for emergencies. Through the peephole, I could see a woman I didn't recognize, professionally dressed and holding a manila envelope. Ms. Romano Whitmore, I'm Sarah Chen from the Riverside Gazette. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about the changes at Whitmore Associates. My blood went cold. The press. Of course the press had gotten hold of the story. A major law firm changing ownership, family drama, inheritance battles. It was exactly the kind of local scandal that newspapers loved to cover. I'm not ready to make any statements, I called through the door. I understand this must be overwhelming, Sarah Chen replied, her voice professional but not unkind. But there are already rumors circulating about the firm's future. Your clients, your employees. They deserve to know what's happening. Clients. Employees. The words hit me like physical blows. In all my shock and confusion about suddenly owning a law firm, I hadn't really processed the human cost of uncertainty. 37 people depended on Whitmore Associates for their livelihoods. Hundreds of clients had entrusted their legal problems to the firm's attorneys. Whatever decisions I made in the coming weeks would ripple outward, affecting lives I'd never considered. Can you slide your business card under the door? I asked. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk. I heard paper rustling, then footsteps retreating down the hallway. The business card that appeared under my door was elegant, expensive, the kind of press contact that dealt with serious news, not gossip columns. My phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria Sterling. Might want to avoid the office today. Richard called an all-hands meeting for 9 a.m. We'll keep you informed. I stared at the message, trying to process the implications. Richard was calling meetings about a firm he didn't own, presumably to reassure employees and clients that nothing really changed, that the family drama wouldn't affect business operations. It was smart, politically savvy, and absolutely infuriating. Another text arrived, this one from an unknown number. "This is James Murphy, senior associate at W&A. Heard about yesterday. Happy to fill you in on what Richard's telling everyone. Coffee?" James Murphy. I remembered him vaguely, a tall, serious man about my age who'd joined the firm while I was in law school. He'd always been polite when we'd crossed paths, but we'd never really talked. The fact that he was reaching out now was either very good news or very bad news. I typed back, "Maple Street Cafe, 10 a.m.? See you there." The cafe was a local institution, the kind of place where community college students studied next to retired professors and where the coffee was good enough to justify the wait. I arrived early and claimed a corner table, positioning myself so I could see anyone who entered. Old
Habits from too many client meetings in public spaces. Always know who's listening, always have an exit strategy. James Murphy arrived precisely at 10, and I could see why my grandmother had hired him. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made people want to trust him, and his handshake was firm without being aggressive. When he sat down across from me, his expression was serious but not hostile. "First," he said without preamble, "congratulations. I know this wasn't how you expected to start the week." I laughed, a short, sharp sound that contained no humor. That's one way to put it. "Second," he continued, "I want you to know that not everyone at the firm is upset about this development. Some of us have been watching the direction things were headed, and we weren't thrilled with what we saw." "What do you mean?" James glanced around the cafe, then leaned forward slightly. "Your uncle is a competent attorney, but he's been making decisions based on billable hours rather than case merit. We've turned down some fascinating pro bono opportunities because they wouldn't generate immediate revenue. We've settled cases that should have gone to trial because clients wanted quick resolutions rather than justice." The criticism was mild, diplomatically phrased, but I could hear the frustration underneath. "And people are okay with that?" "Some people are," James admitted. "The senior partners who've gotten used to their profit-sharing distributions, the associates who want to pay off their law school loans as quickly as possible. But others remember what this place used to be. Your grandmother had a way of making everyone feel like they were part of something important, like the work we did here mattered, beyond the bottom line." He paused to sip his coffee, and I realized he was choosing his words carefully. "What did Richard tell everyone this morning?" I asked. James's expression darkened. "That there had been an administrative error in the estate planning, that you technically own the holding company, but that the operational control remains with the existing partnership structure, that clients shouldn't worry because nothing was really going to change." I felt a flash of anger so intense that my hands clenched involuntarily. "An administrative error?" His exact words. "He also mentioned that you'd probably be happy to sell your interest back to the family once the shock wore off and you realized how complex business ownership actually is." The condescension was breathtaking. Even when faced with the reality that he'd been systematically excluded from the firm's actual ownership, Richard was spinning the situation as a minor hiccup that could be resolved once the adults took charge again. "There's more," James continued, his voice dropping lower. "He's scheduled meetings with the firm's 3 biggest clients this week. Damage control, he's calling it. Making sure they understand that the recent inheritance confusion won't affect their representation. He's trying to lock down the client relationships before I can do anything about them," I realized. That's my read on the situation. I stared into my coffee, watching the cream swirl in patterns that reminded me of the marble floors in the firm's lobby. Everything felt like it was moving too fast, spinning beyond my ability to control or even understand. 24 hours ago, I'd been a public defender with law school loans and a studio apartment. Now I was apparently responsible for an $8 million business, 37 employees, and a legacy that 3 generations of my family had built. What would you do, James, if you were in my position?
He was quiet for a long moment, considering. Honestly, I'd be terrified, but I'd also be excited. This is a chance to build something that matters again, to remember why we all went to law school in the first place. And if I screw it up, if I make the wrong decisions and destroy everything my grandmother worked for, then you'll have tried, he said simply, which is more than some people can say. His words stayed with me as I walked back to my apartment, past the familiar storefronts and bus stops that had defined my small world for the past 3 years. But as I turned onto Maple Street, I saw something that made my stomach clench. Richard's silver Mercedes parked outside the bookstore below my apartment. He was waiting for me in the narrow stairway that led to my front door, his expensive suit looking incongruous in the cramped space that smelled of old books and coffee. When he saw me, his expression was carefully neutral, the face he wore when he was about to deliver bad news to a client. "Isabella, we need to talk. I figured that's why you were lurking in my stairwell. May I come up?" I wanted to say no, wanted to preserve the safety of my small space from the complications he represented. But avoiding the conversation wouldn't make it go away, and part of me was curious to see how he planned to handle this latest development. My studio apartment looked even smaller with Richard in it. He was too tall, too polished, too accustomed to spaces with high ceilings and expensive furniture. He stood awkwardly near the kitchenette, clearly unsure whether to sit on my second-hand couch or remain standing. "Coffee?" I offered, more out of habit than hospitality. "No, thank you." He cleared his throat, the sound formal and rehearsed. "Isabella, I want to apologize for yesterday. The reading was unexpected for all of us, and I may have reacted poorly to the surprise." It wasn't really an apology, more like an acknowledgement that his strategy hadn't worked, but I nodded anyway, waiting to see where he was heading. "The truth is," he continued, "Mother's decision to structure her estate this way puts us all in a difficult position. You've been thrust into a role you're not prepared for, and the firm's stability is at risk during what should be a smooth transition period." "The firm's stability," I repeated. "Not my well-being or my grandmother's wishes. The firm's stability." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Your well-being is important to us all, of course, but we can't ignore the practical realities. This is a complex business with significant legal and financial obligations. One wrong decision could cost millions of dollars, could destroy relationships that took decades to build. So what are you proposing?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "A solution that protects everyone's interests. This is a buyout agreement. The family would purchase your ownership stake for fair market value. We've had the holding company appraised, and we're prepared to offer you $4.2 million. I stared at the number, trying to process it. $4.2 million. Enough to pay off my law school loans, buy a house, never worry about money again. Enough to build whatever kind of legal career I wanted without the crushing weight of financial pressure." "It's generous," Richard continued, misinterpreting my silence as consideration. "More than generous, actually. You'd be financially secure for life, free to pursue your public interest work without worrying about practical concerns, and the firm would return to stable family management." "Family management that doesn't include me?" "Isabella." His voice took on the patient tone he probably used with difficult clients. "You've made it very clear over the past few years that you're not interested in this kind of corporate practice. You've chosen a different path, focused on public service and individual clients. There's nothing wrong with that choice, but it doesn't prepare you to run a major law firm." He wasn't wrong. I had chosen a different path,
had deliberately turned away from the high-stakes corporate law that made firms like Whitmore Associates profitable. I'd chosen clients who couldn't pay much, cases that mattered more than they paid, a career built on principle rather than profit. But as I looked at the buyout agreement in my hands, I could hear my grandmother's voice from the letter Victoria had read yesterday. I have never seen you make a decision based on what would be easy rather than what would be right. Taking Richard's money would be easy. It would solve all my financial problems, eliminate the terrifying responsibility I'd inherited, return my life to its predictable routine of court appearances and client meetings and ramen dinners. But it would also mean that everything my grandmother had worked to preserve would die with her. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I need time to think about it, I said. Richard's expression tightened. Of course. But Isabella, I hope you'll consider this carefully. The longer this situation remains unresolved, the more damage it could do to client relationships, to employee morale, to the firm's reputation in the legal community. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining the reality of the situation. Yesterday's reading has already caused speculation in the legal community. Clients are asking questions, employees are worried about their job security. Every day that passes without clear leadership creates more uncertainty. After he left, I sat on my couch holding the buyout agreement in my hands, staring at the number that would solve every practical problem in my life. $4.2 million. Financial freedom. The end of sleepless nights worrying about rent and loan payments, and whether I could afford to fix my car when it inevitably broke down again. But it would also be the end of something else. The last connection to my grandmother's dreams, the final abandonment of the principles she'd spent her life defending. My phone buzzed with another text from James. Richard's meeting with Morrison Industries moved up to this afternoon. Thought you should know. Morrison Industries, one of the firm's biggest clients, a manufacturing company that had been using Whitmore and Associates for regulatory compliance and environmental issues for over a decade. If Richard locked down that relationship before I could even understand what it entailed, it would make any attempt to change the firm's direction much more difficult. I was still staring at my phone when it rang. Victoria Sterling's name appeared on the screen. Miss Romano Whitmore? I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Actually, your timing is perfect. I could use some advice. I imagine you could. Are you free for lunch? There are some things we should discuss about your options moving forward. An hour later, I was sitting across from Victoria in an elegant downtown restaurant that I'd never been able to afford. She'd chosen a corner table away from the main dining room, the kind of spot where serious conversations happened over expensive wine and carefully prepared food.
I assume Richard has made you an offer, she said without preamble. I nodded, not surprised that she'd guessed. $4.2 million. He says it's generous. Victoria's smile was sharp. It's about 60% of what the holding company is actually worth. He's hoping you don't know enough about business valuation to realize you're being lowballed. The casual way she delivered this information made my stomach clench. How much is it actually worth? Conservatively, $7 million. If you factor in growth potential and the value of long-term client relationships, probably closer to $9 million. I set down my water glass with slightly more force than necessary. So he's trying to cheat me out of $3 to $5 million? He's trying to solve a problem as cheaply as possible, Victoria corrected. From his perspective, you're an obstacle to be managed, not a family member to be treated fairly. The restaurant suddenly felt too warm, too bright, too full of people living normal lives without impossible decisions hanging over their heads. Victoria, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did my grandmother do this? Why didn't she just leave the firm to Richard like everyone expected? Why put me in this position? Victoria was quiet for a moment, her fork poised over her salad as she considered her answer. Your grandmother and I had many conversations over the past 2 years as she planned her estate. She was deeply worried about what would happen to the firm after she died. Not the financial aspects. Richard is competent enough to keep it profitable, but the mission, the purpose, the reason she dedicated her life to building it. She paused to sip her wine, choosing her words carefully. She told me about a conversation she'd had with you during your last year of law school. You'd been offered a position at a large corporate firm in Chicago. Good money, prestigious clients, a fast track to partnership. But you turned it down to work for the public defender's office. I remembered the conversation. It had been one of the few times I'd seen my grandmother truly angry, not at my decision, but at the financial pressures that had made it feel risky. She said you'd told her that you'd gone to law school to help people, not to make rich people richer. And she realized that you were the only person in the family who still believed in the principles that had founded Whitmore Associates. The weight of expectation was crushing. But what if I'm not ready? What if I make terrible decisions and destroy everything she built? Victoria leaned forward, her expression serious. Your grandmother didn't expect you to be perfect, Isabella. She expected you to try. She expected you to care more about justice than profit, more about doing right than doing well. And if that's not enough, then at least you'll have honored her memory by trying to preserve what she valued most. As I walked back to my apartment after lunch, my phone kept buzzing with messages. Marcus, increasingly frantic. We need to resolve this before it affects the quarterly reports. Mother, alternately pleading and demanding. This family drama needs to end before it gets worse. Aunt Caroline deploying full Southern charm. Darling, surely we can work something out that makes everyone happy. But it was the message from an unknown number that stopped me cold. Ms. Romano Whitmore, this is Elena Rodriguez from the Riverside Community Legal Aid Society. We heard about the changes at Whitmore Associates. We were hoping we might be able to schedule a meeting to discuss some opportunities for partnership. Community Legal Aid, the organization that provided free legal services to the city's most vulnerable residents. They'd been trying to partner with major law firms for years, looking for pro bono support and volunteer attorneys to help handle their overwhelming caseload. But firms like Whitmore Associates had always been too busy with paying clients to spare the time. I typed back, I'd be very interested in that conversation. Are you free tomorrow morning? Her response came immediately. I'll clear my calendar. That evening, I called James Murphy and asked if he wanted to grab dinner. We met at a small Italian place near the courthouse, the kind of restaurant where prosecutors and defense attorneys often found themselves at adjacent tables, maintaining the polite fiction that they weren't discussing cases. So, James said after we'd ordered, have you made any decisions? I'm meeting with Community Legal Aid tomorrow. His eyebrows rose. That's not what Richard would do. No, it's not. Good for you. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the weight of unspoken questions hanging between us. Finally, James set down his fork and looked at me directly. Can I tell you something that might be completely inappropriate? I nodded. There are 7 attorneys at the firm who've been talking since yesterday, not plotting or anything dramatic, just talking about what it might be like to work somewhere that cared about more than billable hours again. 7 out of how many? 15 attorneys total, so almost half. The number was surprising. I'd assumed that most of the firm's lawyers were comfortable with Richard's profit-focused approach, that I'd be fighting alone against entrenched interests and established relationships. What about the other 8? James shrugged. 3 are senior partners who've gotten used to large profit distributions.
Two are associates who are focused on paying off law school loans as quickly as possible. The other three, they're still figuring out where they stand. And the staff, the non-lawyers? That's harder to read, but I know that Margaret was beloved by the support staff. She knew everyone's names, remembered their kids' birthdays, made sure people felt valued beyond just their productivity. After dinner, we walked slowly back toward my apartment, taking the long route past the courthouse and the public defender's office where I'd spent the last 3 years learning what justice looked like when it was underfunded and overworked. "James," I said as we paused at the corner of Maple Street, "can I ask you something else that might be inappropriate?" "Fair's fair." "If I decide to keep the firm, if I try to change its direction back toward what my grandmother envisioned, would you stay? Would you help me figure out how to do it?"
He was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the building where I lived, at the bookstore windows below with their displays of used novels and local history. "Isabella," he said finally, "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me that question." The community legal aid office occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in the part of downtown that urban planners politely called transitional. The walls were painted a hopeful yellow that couldn't quite disguise the water stains from last winter's flooding, and the furniture looked like it had been assembled from donations and garage sale finds. But the energy in the room was electric, the kind of purposeful chaos that came from people doing important work with insufficient resources. Elena Rodriguez met me at the door with a smile that transformed her tired face. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that came from seeing too much injustice and not enough time to fix it all. "Miss Romano Whitmore, thank you so much for coming. I have to admit, when we heard about the changes at Whitmore Associates, we weren't sure what to expect." She led me through a maze of desks where attorneys and paralegals worked on laptops that had clearly seen better days, past client consultation rooms that were really just partition corners, to a small conference room with a window that looked out onto the bus station. "Coffee? It's not great, but it's strong." "Please." As she poured from a pot that looked like it had been making coffees since the Clinton administration, Alana glanced at me with the kind of assessment I'd grown used to in my work with the public defender's office, the look that said she was trying to figure out whether I was someone who would actually help or just another well-meaning person who would promise the world and deliver nothing. "Before we start," she said, settling into a chair that creaked ominously, "I want to be honest about what we're dealing with here. We currently have a waiting list of over 400 people who need legal services. Family law, housing disputes, immigration issues, disability claims. Basic legal problems that can destroy people's lives if they don't get help." She pulled out a manila folder thick with case summaries. "This represents 1 month's worth of requests for help that we had to turn away because we don't have the capacity. 1 month, Miss Romano Whitmore." The weight of those numbers settled over me like a physical presence. 400 people. Families facing eviction, immigrants navigating the asylum process, disabled individuals fighting for benefits, parents trying to regain custody of their children, all waiting for help that might never come. "What would partnership with Whitmore Associates look like?" I asked. Elena's expression brightened slightly. "We've been trying to develop formal partnerships with major law firms for years. The idea would be that your attorneys would take on pro bono cases from our referral list, maybe dedicate a certain number of hours per month to community legal aid work. In exchange, we could provide training on areas of law that corporate firms don't usually handle: housing law, benefits advocacy, family court procedures." How many hours per month would make a meaningful difference? If we could get each attorney to commit to just 10 hours a month, it would double our capacity. 20 hours would let us clear the waiting list entirely. 20 hours per month. In the context of a major law firm where attorneys routinely billed 60 to 80 hours a week, it didn't sound like much. But I knew from my own experience how those hours would be viewed as time taken away from paying clients, as a drag on profitability, as the kind of idealistic luxury that successful firms couldn't afford.
Elena, can I be honest with you about something? Please. I inherited ownership of the firm 2 days ago. Before that, they'd been systematically excluding me from family business for 3 months. I have no experience running a law firm, no idea how to manage 37 employees, and half the family is hoping I'll sell out and disappear. Elena studied my face for a long moment. But you're here anyway. I'm here anyway. Why? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized it was the same one I'd been asking myself since Judge Harrison had read my grandmother's letter. Why was I here? Why was I considering taking on a responsibility that terrified me, that I was completely unqualified for, that would probably destroy my previously simple life? Because, I said slowly, I think this is what my grandmother would have wanted. And because I've spent 3 years watching people get crushed by a legal system they can't afford to access. And maybe I'm in a position to do something about that now. Elena's smile was radiant. Then let's talk about specifics. We spent the next 2 hours going through case studies, discussing the practical mechanics of a partnership program, exploring how Whitmore Associates could integrate community legal aid work into its existing structure. Elena showed me success stories from other cities where major firms had embraced pro bono work as a core part of their identity, and the results were impressive. Not just in terms of community impact, but in terms of attorney satisfaction, staff retention, and public reputation. There's something else, Elena said, as our meeting was winding down. Something that might interest you specifically. We've been trying to establish a legal clinic focused on criminal defense, not just public defender overflow, but preventative work, helping people understand their rights during police encounters, expunging old convictions, navigating probation requirements. It's the kind of work that could prevent people from falling into the criminal justice system in the first place. A criminal defense clinic. It was exactly the kind of program my grandmother would have championed, exactly the kind of innovative approach to justice that could make a real difference in people's lives. What would something like that require? Space, funding, and attorneys willing to handle cases that don't pay much but matter a lot. Space, funding, attorneys willing to prioritize justice over profit. I thought about the 7th floor of the Whitmore Associates building, which had been converted to storage when the legal aid clinic had been shuttered 2 years earlier. I thought about the healthy profit margins, which could easily support a significant pro bono program. I thought about James Murphy and the 6 other attorneys who'd been talking about wanting to work somewhere that cared about more than billable hours. Elena, hypothetically, if someone wanted to restart the Whitmore Legal Aid Clinic, what would that look like? Her eyes widened. Are you serious? I'm asking hypothetically. Hypothetically, she said, her voice rising with excitement, it would be amazing. The old clinic had a great reputation before it closed. There are still people in the community who remember what a difference it made. If you could reopen it, if you could staff it with experienced attorneys, she trailed off, shaking her head. But that would require a major commitment from the firm. Not just money, but a fundamental shift in priorities. Your family would never go for it. My family doesn't own the firm, I said quietly. The silence that followed was charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. When I left the community legal aid office, my head was spinning with ideas, and my heart was hammering with the magnitude of what I was considering. Reopening the legal aid clinic wouldn't just be a business decision, it would be a declaration of war against everything Richard had built, everything the family expected, everything that made sense from a purely financial perspective. But as I walked back toward downtown, passing the courthouse where I'd learned to be a lawyer and the public defender's office where I'd learned what justice looked like when it was underfunded, I could hear my grandmother's voice from the letter Victoria had read. The firm needs someone who remembers why it was founded.
My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Sterling. Richard's meeting with Morrison Industries didn't go as planned. Can you call me? I dialed her number immediately. Isabella, I have some interesting news. Morrison Industries has decided to put their legal representation out for competitive bid. What does that mean? It means they're not automatically renewing their contract with Whitmore Associates. Richard's meeting yesterday was supposed to be a routine check-in, but apparently Morrison's new general counsel has some concerns about the firm's direction and stability. The news should have been alarming. Morrison Industries represented almost 15% of the firm's annual revenue, but instead I felt a strange sense of opportunity. Victoria, hypothetically, if someone wanted to compete for that contract with a different approach, say emphasizing environmental law expertise and community engagement rather than just regulatory compliance, what would that look like? There was a pause. That's actually quite clever. Morrison has been under pressure from environmental groups for years. A law firm that could demonstrate genuine commitment to environmental justice might be exactly what they're looking for to improve their public image. And hypothetically, if that same law firm announced a major community legal aid partnership as part of their new direction, Victoria's laugh was warm and approving. Hypothetically, that would be the kind of bold strategic move that could transform both a law firm's reputation and its bottom line. After I hung up, I stood in the middle of the sidewalk, letting pedestrians flow around me like water around a stone, processing what I'd just learned. Richard's attempt to lock down client relationships wasn't working. In fact, his focus on profit over principle might be exactly the vulnerability I could exploit to build something better. My phone rang again, and this time it was James Murphy. Isabella, can you meet me at the office? There's something you need to see. I thought you said I should avoid the office today. That was yesterday. Today is different. Whitmore and Associates looked different in the afternoon sunlight, less forbidding and more familiar. The marble lobby still felt like a monument to legal gravitas, but now I noticed details I'd missed before. The way the afternoon light played across the floors my great-grandfather had chosen, the subtle elegance of the brass fixtures my grandmother had selected, the sense of permanence and purpose that had drawn me to law in the first place. James met me at the security desk, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "What's going on?" I asked as we rode the elevator to the third floor. "Conference room C. There are some people who want to talk to you." The same conference room where my life had changed 2 days earlier was now occupied by a different group entirely. 7 attorneys I recognized from the firm sat around the table, along with 3 people I didn't know, 2 women and a man, all professionally dressed but with the slightly worn edges that suggested they worked for nonprofits or government agencies. James made introductions. The 3 strangers were directors from local legal aid organizations, environmental advocacy groups, and civil rights nonprofits. They'd heard rumors about potential changes at Whitmore and Associates and wanted to explore partnership opportunities. "We know this is premature," said Maria Santos from the Environmental Justice Coalition, "and we know you haven't made any formal decisions about the firm's direction. But if there's even a possibility that Whitmore and Associates might return to its roots as a public interest firm, we want to be part of that conversation." David Kim from the ACLU leaned forward. "Your grandmother's firm used to be our go-to partner for complex civil rights cases. When the legal aid clinic closed, we lost access to the kind of high-level legal expertise that these cases require. If there's a chance of rebuilding that partnership..." The third visitor, Dr. Amanda Foster from the university's legal clinic, spread out a folder of documents. "We've been tracking the impact of law firm pro bono work on community outcomes. Firms that integrate public interest work into their core mission don't just serve their communities better, they also see higher attorney satisfaction, better recruitment, and stronger long-term client relationships." For the next hour, I listened to presentations about partnership opportunities, program models, funding structures, and impact assessments. Each proposal built on the others, creating a vision of what Whitmore and Associates could become, not just a profitable law firm, but a force for justice in the community.
The question, said Sarah Chen, one of the attorneys from the firm, not the reporter who'd knocked on my door that morning, is whether we can make the business case for this kind of transformation. The senior partners are going to want to see numbers that prove this won't destroy the firm financially. Dr. Foster smiled. Actually, that's the easy part. Firms that embrace significant pro bono work typically see revenue increases within 3 years. Corporate clients increasingly want to work with firms that demonstrate social responsibility, especially in environmental and human rights law. She pulled out a chart showing revenue trends at law firms with strong public interest components. The key is marketing the transition properly. You're not becoming a legal aid organization, you're becoming a full-service firm with a serious commitment to justice. As the meeting continued, I found myself taking notes frantically, trying to capture all of the possibilities they were describing. A reopened legal aid clinic, partnerships with environmental groups, civil rights litigation, criminal justice reform work, immigration law support. It was overwhelming and inspiring and terrifying all at once. But it was also something else. It was exactly what my grandmother had spent her life building before economics and family pressure had slowly eroded her vision. When the visitors left, the 7 attorneys remained, and the conversation shifted to practical realities. "Richard's not going to support any of this," said Tom Bradley, a senior associate who'd been with the firm for 12 years. "He's already talking about the need for stability and continuity." "Richard doesn't own the firm. Isabella does," James replied. "But Richard controls the day-to-day operations. He manages the client relationships, oversees the staff, makes the financial decisions. Even if Isabella has legal ownership, he has practical control." The observation was sobering but accurate. Legal ownership was one thing, operational control was another entirely. As long as Richard maintained his position as managing partner, as long as the other attorneys looked to him for leadership, as long as clients viewed him as the face of the firm, my ownership would be largely symbolic. "So what are you suggesting?" I asked Lisa. "I'm suggesting that if you're serious about changing the firm's direction, you need to be prepared to take operational control, not just ownership, management."
The words hung in the air like a challenge. Taking operational control would mean confronting Richard directly, would mean assuming responsibility for every aspect of the business, would mean making enemies of family members who were already skeptical of my capabilities. And if I'm not ready for that level of responsibility? Sarah Chan leaned forward. Then we help you get ready. We've all been watching this firm drift away from its founding principles. We're tired of turning down interesting cases because they don't pay enough. We're tired of billing hours on regulatory compliance work that puts us to sleep. If you're willing to fight for something better, we're willing to fight with you. The commitment in her voice was echoed around the table, and I realized that what I was seeing wasn't just professional ambition or idealistic dreaming. These were attorneys who had chosen to work at Whitmore Associates because of its reputation, its history, its connection to something larger than profit margins. They'd been waiting for someone to remind them why they'd become lawyers in the first place. As I walked home that evening, my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. "Isabella, we need to talk. This situation has gone on long enough." "I'm listening." "Your uncle is beside himself. Clients are asking questions, employees are gossiping, and there are rumors flying around the legal community. You have to understand that your decisions don't just affect you, they affect everyone who depends on this firm for their livelihood." "I understand that, Mom." "Do you? Because it seems like you're enjoying the drama, enjoying the power of making everyone wait while you figure out what you want to do." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Part of me was enjoying the fact that the family members who had excluded me for months were now desperately concerned about my decisions. Part of me was savoring the reversal of power, the moment when the people who had dismissed me as irrelevant suddenly realized they needed my approval. "That's not what this is about," I said. "Then what is it about, Isabella? What do you want?" It was the same question Elena had asked, the same question I'd been asking myself since Judge Harrison had read my grandmother's letter. What did I want? "I want," I said slowly, "to honor grandmother's memory. I want to build something that matters. I want to use the law to help people instead of just making money."
That's very noble. My mother's voice was sharp with frustration. But Noble doesn't pay the mortgage. Noble doesn't keep 37 people employed. Noble doesn't maintain the reputation that 3 generations of this family have built. Maybe the reputation needs to change. The silence that followed was long and cold. Isabella, my mother said finally, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. This family has tolerated your idealism, your impractical career choices, your stubborn insistence on doing things the hard way. We've supported you financially, emotionally, and professionally, even when your decisions made no sense to us. She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. But this is different. This affects all of us. And if you choose to pursue some misguided crusade that destroys what your grandmother actually built, not what she claimed to believe in, but
The words hung in the air like a challenge. Taking operational control would mean confronting Richard directly, would mean assuming responsibility for every aspect of the business, would mean making enemies of family members who were already skeptical of my capabilities. And if I'm not ready for that level of responsibility, Sarah Chen leaned forward, then we help you get ready. We've all been watching this firm drift away from its founding principles. We're tired of turning down interesting cases because they don't pay enough. We're tired of billing hours on regulatory compliance work that puts us to sleep. If you're willing to fight for something better, we're willing to fight with you. The commitment in her voice was echoed around the table, and I realized that what I was seeing wasn't just professional ambition or idealistic dreaming. These were attorneys who had chosen to work at Whitmore Associates because of its reputation, its history, its connection to something larger than profit margins. They'd been waiting for someone to remind them why they'd become lawyers in the first place. As I walked home that evening, my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. Isabella, we need to talk. This situation has gone on long enough. I'm listening. Your uncle is beside himself. Clients are asking questions, employees are gossiping, and there are rumors flying around the legal community. You have to understand that your decisions don't just affect you, they affect everyone who depends on this firm for their livelihood. I understand that, Mom. Do you? Because it seems like you're enjoying the drama, enjoying the power of making everyone wait while you figure out what you want to do. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Part of me was enjoying the fact that the family members who had excluded me for months were now desperately concerned about my decisions. Part of me was savoring the reversal of power, the moment when the people who had dismissed me as irrelevant suddenly realized they needed my approval. That's not what this is about, I said. Then what is it about, Isabella? What do you want? It was the same question Elena had asked, the same question I'd been asking myself since Judge Harrison had read my grandmother's letter. What did I want? I want, I said slowly, to honor grandmother's memory. I want to build something that matters. I want to use the law to help people instead of just making money. That's very noble. My mother's voice was sharp with frustration. But Noble doesn't pay the mortgage. Noble doesn't keep 37 people employed. Noble doesn't maintain the reputation that 3 generations of this family have built. Maybe the reputation needs to change. The silence that followed was long and cold. Isabella, my mother said finally, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. This family has tolerated your idealism, your impractical career choices, your stubborn insistence on doing things the hard way. We've supported you financially, emotionally, and professionally, even when your decisions made no sense to us. She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. But this is different. This affects all of us. And if you choose to pursue some misguided crusade that destroys what your grandmother actually built, not what she claimed to believe in, 2 years after the transformation began, Isabella was invited to deliver the keynote address at Georgetown Law's commencement ceremony.
Standing where she had received her own degree 7 years earlier, she spoke to hundreds of new attorneys about the importance of building careers that aligned with their values. The message resonated powerfully with young lawyers who had watched the legal profession struggle with questions of purpose and social relevance. Many sought out opportunities to work with organizations like Whitmore Associates, choosing meaningful work over maximum compensation. The firm's success attracted national attention. Legal journals featured articles about the Whitmore model. Business magazines highlighted the financial benefits of socially responsible legal practice. National newspapers covered the firm as an example of how traditional institutions could adapt to changing social expectations. But for Isabella, the real measure of success remained the direct impact on people's lives. Families who kept their homes because the firm fought illegal foreclosures, communities that stayed healthy because they stopped environmental pollution, immigrants who achieved citizenship because skilled attorneys navigated the system with them. 5 years after her inheritance, Isabella announced the most ambitious expansion yet: the creation of the Whitmore Community Justice Center. This $5 million project would house expanded legal aid services, mediation programs, community education workshops, and satellite offices for nonprofit organizations across the city. The groundbreaking ceremony brought together city officials, community leaders, attorneys from across the state, and representatives from dozens of partner organizations. Even family members who had initially been skeptical, including her mother, Aunt Caroline, and eventually Uncle Richard, came to support the vision they had once opposed. The Justice Center represented something unprecedented: a sustainable model for comprehensive community legal services, funded by the profits of a successful law firm and supported by grants from foundations impressed by the organization's demonstrated impact. Recognizing that lasting change required training the next generation of attorneys, Isabella championed the creation of the Margaret E. Whitmore School of Public Interest Law. This institution would provide rigorous legal education combined with practical skills in community organizing, nonprofit management, and social change strategy. The school's curriculum became a model for other institutions interested in preparing lawyers for careers that served both professional success and social justice. When Isabella delivered the commencement address to the school's first graduating class 15 years after her inheritance, she spoke to 25 young attorneys who represented a new generation of legal professionals, trained to see law as a tool for justice, prepared to build careers that mattered. As the Whitmore model proved its effectiveness over 20 decades, it spread across the country. Law firms in Portland, Atlanta, Chicago, and dozens of other cities adapted Isabella's approach to their own communities and practice areas. The model's influence extended beyond individual firms to shape legal education, bar association policies, and professional standards. Isabella herself became a nationally recognized expert on sustainable legal practice. She consulted with law firms interested in developing community partnerships, served on boards of legal aid organizations, and influenced policy discussions about access to justice. At 43, she was appointed to the state Supreme Court, though she maintained her connection to the Justice Center as chair of its board of directors. The American Bar Association commissioned studies showing that community-based legal service models had transformed access to justice across the United States. The Whitmore approach was consistently cited as the most successful and widely replicated model, credited with changing how legal services were delivered to underserved communities. By the organization's 20th anniversary, the numbers told a remarkable story.
The Whitmore Community Justice Center operated in 42 cities across the country, employed over 3,000 people, and had served more than 200,000 clients who might never have had access to quality legal representation.
But Isabella understood that the real measure of success couldn't be captured in statistics alone. It was visible in the changed lives of individual clients, the transformed culture of the legal profession, the inspired careers of young attorneys who chose service over self-interest. The model had proved that law firms could be financially successful while serving community needs. It had demonstrated that attorneys could build meaningful careers without sacrificing professional competence or economic security. Most importantly, it had shown that justice wasn't just an ideal to be pursued in spare time, but a practical foundation for building lasting institutions. As Isabella prepared to retire from active practice 30 years after that rain-soaked morning when she first learned of her inheritance, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from excluded outsider to transformational leader. The final scene of her active involvement played out in the same conference room where Judge Harrison had first announced her inheritance. Now surrounded by the next generation of leaders who would guide the organization into its fourth decade, Isabella passed along the lessons she had learned about building institutions that outlast their founders. The leather portfolio she carried had grown thick with 3 decades of documents chronicling victories won and communities served. But the most important legacy wasn't contained in files or financial statements. It was embedded in the lives of people who have found justice when they needed it most, in the careers of attorneys who had discovered that meaningful work could also be financially sustainable, in the communities that had been strengthened by having access to quality legal representation. Isabella's story offers profound insights for anyone interested in creating positive social change through professional work. Her journey demonstrates that principle and profit can coexist. The Whitmore model proved that organizations can be financially successful while serving social needs. Success doesn't require choosing between doing good and doing well. Sustainable change requires institution building. Individual acts of service, while valuable, have limited impact compared to creating systems that can serve communities for generations. Legacy is created, not inherited. Isabella transformed her unexpected inheritance into something far more valuable than what she received, a model for justice that influenced an entire profession. Community partnerships amplify impact. Working with established community organizations multiplied the firm's effectiveness far beyond what it could have achieved alone. Cultural change takes time, but creates lasting results. Transforming the culture of the firm was more challenging than changing policies, but it created sustainable change that outlasted individual leadership. Young people hunger for meaningful work. Isabella's model attracted talented attorneys specifically because it offered the opportunity to build careers that aligned with personal values.
Perhaps most remarkably, Isabella's transformation of one law firm created a ripple effect that changed the entire legal profession's understanding of what was possible. Law schools began teaching courses about sustainable social justice practice. Bar associations created awards for firms that combined profitability with social responsibility. Young attorneys increasingly sought out opportunities to work with organizations that prioritize community service alongside professional excellence. The story of Whitmore Associates became a case study in business schools, a model in nonprofit management programs, and an inspiration for social entrepreneurs across various fields. It demonstrated that traditional institutions could be transformed from within, that inherited privilege could be leveraged for social justice, and that one person's commitment to principle could create change far beyond what seemed initially possible. As we face contemporary challenges that require innovative approaches to social justice, from climate change to economic inequality to systemic discrimination, Isabella's story provides a roadmap for creating change through professional practice.
Her model suggests that the most effective path forward may not be abandoning existing institutions, but transforming them to serve broader purposes. The Whitmore Community Justice Center continues to operate today, serving as proof that sustainable social change is possible when vision meets practical action, when individual commitment combines with institutional resources, and when the pursuit of justice becomes not just a personal calling, but a professional practice. Isabella Romano Whitmore's journey from excluded granddaughter to transformational leader reminds us that the most powerful legacies are often created by people who were never supposed to have power at all, but who used their unexpected opportunities to serve something greater than themselves. Subscribe now and become part of a movement that believes professional success and social justice aren't just compatible, they're most powerful when they work together. Join thousands of other listeners who are building careers that matter, creating organizations that serve, and proving every day that one person's commitment to principle can indeed change the world. Don't forget to subscribe and share this story with someone who might need to hear that unexpected opportunities can become the foundation for extraordinary impact.